Welcome to the Ultimate MetaSounds Reference Guide, Triggers. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the accumulate, any, compare, control, counter, delay, filter, on threshold, on value change, once, pipe, repeat, route, sequence, and toggle nodes. Now you may be thinking that's a lot of nodes to cover in one video, but the thing is, all of these nodes have the exact same purpose, to trigger an event. The only real difference is how they're triggered and what they do with that trigger. First up is our accumulate. This node comes in 1 to 8 inputs and will collect triggers until all input triggers have been executed. Once all input triggers have been executed, this node will then trigger its own output trigger. It's important to note that the input triggers do not need to be executed in a specific order. So let's say you have 8 coins in a level, and you want fanfare to play once all the coins have been collected. You could set up each coin to execute its own trigger that is running into this trigger accumulate node, and then have this trigger a wave player with a fanfare stinger. The trigger any node has between 2 and 8 inputs and functions kind of like the opposite of the trigger accumulate. So instead of collecting all the input triggers and then executing the output trigger, the any node will execute its output trigger anytime any of the input triggers are hit, regardless of how many have been hit before. Using our same coin collection mechanic for this example, we already have the accumulate set up to play our fanfare when we've collected all the coins. But what if we also had a pickup sound to play when we've collected each one? Instead of having 8 separate wave players loaded with the exact same sound, we can use our trigger any node to trigger the same wave player for all the coins. The trigger compare has a Boolean, float, and integer variant, and will compare the values of A to the value of B against whichever type parameter you have selected. From there, you can output 2 separate triggers based on whether the comparison is true or false. The trigger control acts like a gate. When the gate is open, the trigger in will be passed through to the trigger out. We can temporarily suspend triggering by closing the gate, or temporarily allow triggering by opening it. We have independent controls over the open and close status of the gate, or we can use a single trigger to toggle between the two states. We also have a Boolean input to define what state the trigger control node starts in. The trigger counter does exactly that. It counts. We can define a starting value and a step size. Then each time this node is triggered, it will add the step size to the accumulated value. We also have the ability to reset the trigger, which will return the counter back to its original starting value. On the output side, we can use the on trigger pin to pass that trigger input through. We can use the on reset output to pass our reset trigger through, and we have outputs to pass along the count and value data. The trigger delay allows you to hold an input trigger for a set amount of time in seconds before it is passed through. Sending another trigger input while there is currently one being held will restart the delay timer. If no other inputs are received, it will then trigger the output after the delay time has depleted. Triggering the reset input will purge the node if it is currently holding a trigger waiting to be executed and return it to its initial state ready for a new trigger. The trigger filter will randomly select between one of 2 outputs. We can manipulate the outcome to a degree with our seed and probability inputs. Seeds are values processed through an algorithm to generate a random sequence. A -1 value will give you a truly random sequence each time your MetaSound is played. Any other value will generate a seemingly random sequence. However, once the node is reset and the sequence starts again, the output sequence will be in the exact same order. The probability input accepts a value between 0 and 1 and determines if the output will favor heads or tails more. A value of 0 will give all tails, a value of 1 will give all heads, and a value of 0.5 will give equal probability to both outcomes. The trigger on threshold allows us to use an incoming audio signal as your trigger source and use the threshold input to define the trigger point. If the value of the incoming audio signal breaks the set threshold, then the node will trigger. Any value input below the threshold will leave this node dormant. Using the type dropdown, we can also define what part of the audio signal is used to constitute a threshold break. The trigger on value change comes in 3 variants: Boolean, float, and integer. We can connect different sources to these nodes, and when our MetaSound is activated, it will take a snapshot of the current value being input. It will then monitor that input in real time. The moment the input value changes, the node will execute a trigger. Trigger once does just that. It works like a gate, but will only allow a single trigger to pass through. It then blocks all further throughput. We do, however, have the ability to open the gate back up by using the reset input. This will open the gate back up and allow another singular input through. We also have the ability to use the start closed boolean to determine whether or not the gate begins open or shut. Keep in mind, if you start with the gate closed, you must first trigger the reset before you can allow a trigger through. The trigger pipe works similarly to the trigger delay, except the timer on the trigger pipe node does not reset if it's currently holding an input and another input is received. Instead, this node will allow inputs to stack up. As they stack up, they each start their own individual delay timer and are then passed through when their specific timer expires. Trigger repeat allows you to trigger this node once, and it will keep triggering over and over based on the parameter set in the period input. We can also stop the node from repeating using the stop input. The trigger route node, which could be more appropriately titled trigger set value, does precisely that. When triggered, it will output whichever value correlates to its respective input. This node comes in several variants: audio, boolean, float, integer, and time, and each of these variants also comes in 2 to 8 inputs. It's important to note that this value change is instant. There is no interpolation or glide. The trigger sequence has 2 to 8 outputs and allows you to execute a string of triggers one at a time in order. So the first time this node is triggered, it will execute output 0. On the next trigger, while the MetaSound is still playing, we'll execute output 1 and on down the line. The reset input will return the node back to its initial state, where the next time it's triggered, we'll start with output 0. We also have the ability to set whether or not the sequence loops back to the beginning. With loop enabled, on an 8 output node, if an input is received after the 8th output has been executed, the node will start over and execute output 0. With loop disabled, if output 8 is executed, the next input will execute output 8 again and again until the node is reset, either by triggering the reset input or by stopping the MetaSound and starting it again. The last of our trigger nodes is our trigger toggle. This node allows us to set whether a Boolean input is enabled or not, just like a light switch. We have the ability to set the initial state of the Boolean we are connected to. It's important to note that whatever we set as our initial value will be passed along when the MetaSound it's contained in is activated, even if the trigger toggle has not yet received an input. On the other side of the node, aside from our value output, we also have a trigger output. This output will execute anytime the node is toggled, regardless of whether it's the on or off input that's activated. To see the full list of videos in this reference guide, click the link to the playlist in the description below.